I have sat on this bench for decades, and during that time, I have seen every variation of human behavior you can possibly imagine. People have walked into my courtroom trembling with genuine fear. Others have marched in with righteous indignation, clutching thick folders of receipts. But there is a specific breed of litigant that always catches my attention, the ones who walk through those heavy wooden doors believing they are the smartest person in the room. They walk in like they own the place, projecting an untouchable confidence that they think will serve as a shield against reality. Let me tell you a secret about the courtroom. Arrogance is usually the first sign of a fabricated story. The case I am about to share with you didn't involve millions of dollars, and it wasn't a high-profile corporate lawsuit. It was a small claims dispute over $6,500. But the moment that unfolded during this hearing was so audacious, so incredibly brazen, that the entire room collectively held its breath. It is a story that proves why power, privilege, and a slick suit can never outrun the truth. The defendant was a 28-year-old man named Marcus Vance. Marcus came from a wealthy family, the kind of family where the name alone usually opens doors and closes problems. He was dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than the amount he was being sued for. From the second he sat at the defendant's table, he leaned back, crossed his arms, and wore a smirk that practically screamed that he was untouchable. He didn't look at the plaintiff. He didn't look at the bailiff. He looked directly at me, completely devoid of the natural anxiety that innocent people experience when a judge is deciding their fate. On the other side of the aisle sat Arthur Pendleton, a 6'8" mechanic who had owned a local auto restoration shop for over 40 years. Arthur looked exhausted. His hands were calloused, stained with decades of motor oil, and his shoulders were slumped with the heavy frustration of a working-class man who felt bullied by a system he barely understood. Arthur was suing Marcus for unpaid labor and parts. According to the filing, Arthur had completely rebuilt the transmission of Marcus's vintage sports car. Marcus had authorized the work, signed the initial estimate, taken the keys, and then simply canceled the check, claiming the work was defective. But Marcus wasn't just claiming the work was defective. He was claiming he had absolute, irrefutable proof. As I opened the case file, I noticed Marcus tapping his expensive pen against the table, completely relaxed. He thought his fabricated reality would hold up under the harsh lights of a court of law. He was about to learn a very painful lesson about what happens when privilege meets reality. I started the proceedings by asking Mr. Pendleton to state his case. Arthur stood up slowly. He didn't have a slick presentation or an expensive lawyer whispering in his ear. He just had his original grease-stained handwritten ledger, a stack of faded receipts for parts, and a quiet dignity. He explained, in clear and methodical terms, that he had spent over 70 hours meticulously rebuilding the transmission of Marcus's 1969 Jaguar E-Type. He walked me through the entire process, detailing the specific rare parts he had been forced to source from overseas. When it came time for payment, Marcus had arrived, taken the car for a test drive around the block, parked it, smiled, handed Arthur a check for the full amount, and driven off. 2 days later, the check bounced. Marcus had intentionally placed a stop payment on it. When I turned my attention to the defendant, Marcus didn't even wait for me to ask a direct question. He simply slid a glossy, professionally bound folder across the table toward the bailiff. "Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with unmistakable condescension, "I stopped the payment because the man is an absolute fraud. The transmission was completely ruined before I even got it on the highway. I had to take it to a real specialist to get it fixed. In my courtroom, I deal in evidence, not arrogance." I opened the folder. Inside was a pristine, highly detailed invoice from a high-end exotic car dealership across town. It totaled nearly $12,000 for a complete transmission overhaul, and it was dated just 3 days after Arthur had returned the vehicle. It looked entirely legitimate. It had a sharp corporate logo, itemized labor costs, a list of replacement parts, and a signature from a master technician named David Sterling. Marcus leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms again, a smug smile playing on his lips. He looked over at Arthur the way someone might look at gum stuck to the bottom of their shoe. "As you can see from the documentation, Judge, not only do I owe this scam artist absolutely nothing, but he actually owes me for the damages. I am countersuing for the $12,000. A quiet murmur rippled through the gallery. Arthur looked momentarily stunned, his calloused hands tightly gripping the edge of his table. He shook his head slowly, the exhaustion in his eyes deepening. "That's a lie, Your Honor. That car was running perfectly when it left my shop. I test drove it myself. I looked back down at the glossy invoice. At first glance, it was exactly the kind of document that usually wins civil cases. A professional, expensive assessment seamlessly overriding a small-town mechanic's word. But decades of looking at forged documents, altered contracts, and fabricated timelines teach you to look past the fancy letterhead. I adjusted my glasses and began to read the heavily itemized list of parts on Marcus's irrefutable evidence. And that is exactly when I noticed the first thread of his elaborate, arrogant lie beginning to unravel. I looked down at the heavily itemized list of parts on the dealership's invoice. At a glance, it was an intimidating wall of mechanical jargon, part numbers, and exorbitant prices designed to completely overwhelm the court and shut down any argument. But experienced judges don't just read the grand total at the bottom of a page, we read the details. And the details are where liars always make their fatal mistakes. Item number 4 on Marcus's supposedly irrefutable invoice was a transmission control module, a sophisticated electronic computer unit used to regulate shifting in modern automatic transmissions. I slowly looked up from the paper and stared directly at Marcus. He was still wearing that smug, calculated smirk, leaning back in his chair, completely unaware that he had just handed me the rope to hang his own case. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet hum of the courtroom, "would you consider yourself a car enthusiast?" He chuckled softly, adjusting the knot of his designer tie. "I own several high-end vintage vehicles, Your Honor. I know exactly what it takes to maintain them. That's precisely why I know Mr. Pendleton's work was a complete disaster." "I see," I replied, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. "And this invoice from Sterling Exotics represents the exact necessary repairs required to fix the damage caused by the plaintiff?" "Absolutely," Marcus stated, without a single second of hesitation, every single line. I turned my attention to Arthur Pendleton. The older mechanic was watching the exchange with cautious, tired eyes. "Mr. Pendleton," I asked, "what kind of transmission does a 1969 Jaguar E-Type have?" Arthur didn't even need to consult his grease-stained ledger. "It's a 4-speed manual, Your Honor. Fully mechanical. It's a beautiful, old-school piece of engineering." I turned back to Marcus, holding his glossy, $12,000 piece of evidence up in the air. "That is fascinating, Mr. Vance, because according to this detailed invoice, your master technician charged you over $2,000 to replace the electronic transmission control module." The courtroom fell dead silent. The smirk vanished from Marcus's face so quickly it was as if someone had reached out and flipped a switch. "Mr. Vance," I continued, leaning forward over the bench, "a 1969 Jaguar does not have an electronic control module. It is a completely mechanical, manual transmission. You cannot replace a computer part on a car that was built before those computers existed." Marcus blinked. The color rapidly drained from his cheeks. His confident posture suddenly looked incredibly rigid. He opened his mouth to speak, closed it, and looked down at his table in a panic, frantically searching for an excuse. That untouchable energy he had so proudly displayed when he walked through my doors was evaporating by the second. He had brought fabricated evidence into a court of law, but as I watched him squirm, I realized the unraveling of Marcus Vance had only just begun. When a carefully constructed lie collapses in a courtroom, it rarely happens in slow motion. It happens all at once. For the first 20 minutes of the hearing, Marcus Vance had been a masterclass in performative superiority. He had relied entirely on the intimidating aura of wealth and the assumption that his polished appearance would serve as an impenetrable shield. Now, sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights, he was just a young man rapidly running out of oxygen. He stammered, his eyes darting frantically between the glossy invoice in my hand and my face. "Well, Your Honor, I am not a mechanic. I simply paid the bill they handed me. If there is a discrepancy with the parts listed, that is entirely the fault of Sterling Exotics, not me." It was a classic pivot. When cornered, manipulative people will immediately attempt to transfer the blame to an absent third party to avoid accountability. But I wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. "A $2,000 discrepancy for a non-existent computer part, Mr. Vance?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave. "You claimed just moments ago that you knew exactly what it takes to maintain these vintage vehicles. Now you want the court to believe you blindly paid $12,000 without reading the itemized receipt?" Marcus swallowed hard and adjusted his expensive collar. He was sweating now. Actual, visible beads of sweat were forming on his forehead. The mask of untouchable arrogance had completely shattered, revealing the absolute panic underneath. I trust my specialists, Your Honor. Let's talk about these specialists, I said, picking up the invoice again. I looked closely at the elegant letterhead. It was incredibly well designed, complete with a faint watermark and a sleek, modern font. But something about the address at the top caught my eye. It listed an address on Oakwood Drive, a major commercial thoroughfare I drive past every single day on my way to the courthouse. I turned to the clerk. Madam Clerk, please run a quick corporate registry search for a business named Sterling Exotics, located on Oakwood Drive. Marcus's head snapped up, his eyes widening in genuine terror. Your Honor, is that really necessary? I have the signed document right here. The evidence is right in front of you. In my courtroom, Mr. Vance, we verify, I told him flatly. If you paid them $12,000 just 3 days ago, their business license should be very easy to find. The silence in the room stretched out, thick and suffocating. Arthur Pendleton sat quietly, his calloused hands resting calmly on the plaintiff's table. The older mechanic was watching the arrogant young man who had tried to destroy his livelihood begin to unravel completely. Less than a minute later, the clerk looked up from her monitor. Your Honor, she said, her voice carrying through the quiet room. There is no business registered under the name Sterling Exotics anywhere in this state. Furthermore, the address listed on that invoice belongs to an abandoned strip mall that was scheduled for demolition last month. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the gallery. Marcus Vance hadn't just exaggerated a repair bill or exaggerated a defect. He had fabricated an entire business out of thin air, printed a fake invoice, and submitted it to a judge as sworn evidence. I watched Marcus Vance as he sat there, his mouth slightly agape, the color having completely drained from his face. He had arrived at my courthouse fully expecting to steamroll a retired mechanic with nothing but a flashy suit, a sense of unearned entitlement, and a piece of paper he probably paid a few dollars for at a print shop. He looked like a man who had never been told no in his entire life, and the sudden realization that his influence, his name, and his manufactured evidence had absolutely zero currency in my courtroom was clearly hitting him with the force of a freight train. Mr. Vance, I said, my voice echoing slightly in the sudden, heavy silence of the room. You have not only wasted this court's time, you have committed a very serious offense. You have presented a document that you swore under oath was a legitimate invoice, yet this business does not exist, and the address belongs to a property that is literally rubble. Marcus tried to stand, perhaps to walk out, or perhaps just to find a place to hide. Your Honor, I was misled. My assistant handled the repairs, and I just paid what I was told. Sit down, I commanded. Do not insult my intelligence any further. You stated that you were a car enthusiast who knew exactly what went into these machines. You cannot claim to be an expert on the vehicle one moment and a victim of a fake repair shop the next. This is perjury, sir, and in this courtroom, we do not tolerate people who think they can simply invent a reality to suit their own pockets. The atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. What started as a simple, pathetic attempt to stiff a blue-collar worker for $6,500 had blossomed into a full-scale legal disaster for Marcus. The spectators in the back of the room were no longer whispering. They were watching with rapt attention, witnessing a rare and deeply satisfying moment where someone who clearly believed they were above the rules was being dragged back down to earth. Arthur Pendleton remained quiet, his hands still folded on the table. He didn't look triumphant. He looked relieved. For months, he had been gaslighted by this man, told that he was the one who failed, told that his professional integrity was worthless, all because Marcus Vance assumed he could outmaneuver a man who lived by the simple principles of hard work and honesty. I looked at the clerk. Madam Clerk, please mark this invoice as Exhibit A. This document will be forwarded to the District Attorney's Office for a formal investigation into potential fraud and perjury. Marcus flinched at the mention of the DA. His hands, which had been so confidently tapping a pen only minutes ago, were now shaking beneath the table. The reality of his situation, the potential for criminal charges, the public humiliation, the destruction of the very reputation he had used as a shield was finally sinking in. He looked around the courtroom, perhaps searching for a sympathetic face, but he found none. In a room full of people, he was entirely alone, trapped by the weight of his own calculated lies. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Marcus Vance, usually so quick with a cutting remark or a dismissive wave of his hand, stood paralyzed. He was trapped. The game was up, and he knew it. He started stammering, his voice rising in an uncharacteristic pitch, trying to deflect the blame again. You don't understand. The repair shop, my father's firm. They recommended them. My father, Robert Vance, he handles all my legal and financial affairs. He would never allow me to use a fraudulent company. This is a mistake. Arthur Pendleton must have altered the documents himself. It was a desperate, cowardly play. He was attempting to weaponize his father's reputation to intimidate the court, hoping the mere mention of a powerful name would buy him a stay of execution. He looked toward the back of the courtroom, expecting his father to rise, to object, to use his influence to shut down the proceedings and intimidate the witness. Then, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. The entire gallery turned in unison. A man in his 60s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, walked down the center aisle. It was Robert Vance. He didn't look like a man coming to save his son. His face was a mask of cold, hard stone. Marcus's face lit up for a fleeting second. He thought his cavalry had arrived. "Father, tell them, this mechanic is a fraud. Tell them." Robert Vance stopped mid-aisle. He didn't even look at his son. He walked past the gallery, past the press bench, and stopped directly in front of the defendant's table. He looked at Arthur Pendleton, who was visibly nervous, then turned his gaze toward me. He didn't offer a polite nod or a friendly smile. He bowed his head slightly to the court in a gesture of absolute, profound respect. "Your Honor," Robert Vance said, his voice deep and steady, devoid of any paternal warmth. "I have been sitting in the back for the last 20 minutes. I have heard every word spoken. I have seen the evidence presented." Marcus's smirk was gone. He looked smaller, his shoulders sagging as if the very air had been sucked out of him. He looked at his father with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. He expected a shield. He was standing in front of an executioner. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the light fixtures. Every person in that room understood that the dynamic of the case had just shifted from a simple contract dispute to a reckoning of character. Robert Vance was a man who had built an empire on integrity, and he wasn't about to let his name be used as a shroud for his son's dishonesty. The power he possessed, the power Marcus had tried to wield, was now being turned against the one who had tried to abuse it. And Marcus, for the first time in his life, looked truly, utterly terrified. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with the shock of the fabricated evidence, fell into a silence so profound it felt like the air itself had been sucked out of the room. Robert Vance stood there, his posture rigid, his gaze locked on his son, a gaze that held no warmth, only a chilling, disappointed resolve. "Mr. Pendleton," Robert said, his voice resonant and steady, "I apologize on behalf of my family. I have spent the last half hour observing this proceeding, and I am appalled." Marcus, realizing that his only ally had turned into his most formidable opponent, scrambled to his feet. "Father, please, you don't know the whole story. They are trying to ruin me." Robert raised a single hand, effectively silencing his son. It was a gesture of absolute authority, the same authority that had clearly built the massive firm his son took for granted. "I know enough, Marcus. I know that integrity is the only currency that matters in this life. You have consistently chosen to spend your reputation on lies, and today, you have bankrupted your standing in this court." He turned back to the bench, addressing me directly. "Your Honor, I would like to offer a motion. I will personally write a check to Mr. Pendleton for the full amount of his claim, including the legal costs and interest. Furthermore, I will cover the cost of a full inspection of the vehicle by an independent, third-party master mechanic of your choosing to ensure the transmission work was indeed completed to the highest standard." Arthur Pendleton looked up, his eyes widening. "Sir, you don't have to." "I do, Mr. Pendleton," Robert interrupted, his voice softening just a fraction. "I have raised my son to be a man of character. If I have failed in that regard, it is my responsibility to correct the damage he has caused. I will not have my family name associated with the theft of a hard-working man's labor." I sat back, observing the scene. I've seen many parents try to buy their way out of their children's mistakes, but this was different. This wasn't a bribe. This was an act of public accountability. Robert Vance was forcing his son to face the reality of his own moral bankruptcy in front of everyone he had tried to impress. "The court accepts the motion, Mr. Vance," I said, my voice firm. "However, the perjury charge remains. My clerk will still be forwarding the file to the district attorney's office. The integrity of this court is not something that can be purchased with a check, no matter who writes it." Robert nodded slowly, acknowledging the ruling. He then turned to his son, his voice dropping to a low, icy whisper that the microphone still managed to pick up. "You are done, Marcus. You have disgraced yourself, and you have disgraced this family. Do not contact me until you have learned that the world does not owe you a path paved with lies." With that, Robert Vance turned and walked out of the courtroom. He didn't look back. He left his son standing there, exposed and trembling, in the middle of a room that was suddenly overwhelmingly silent. Marcus finally collapsed back into his chair, the weight of his father's departure hitting him harder than any gavel ever could. The performance was over. The truth had arrived, and it had left nothing in its wake but the wreckage of a shattered reputation. The weight of Robert Vance's words settled over the courtroom like a heavy shroud. It wasn't just a simple apology, it was a total disavowal of the values his son had displayed, proving that for some, integrity remains the highest form of currency. Seeing a parent choose justice over blind loyalty to their own child is a rare sight in my courtroom, and it was a moment that redefined what power means in the eyes of the law. I looked down at Marcus, the young man who had entered my court with the misplaced confidence of someone who thought he was untouchable, was now visibly trembling, his carefully constructed persona of privilege utterly dismantled. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice echoing with a finality that silenced any lingering murmurs. "There are many people who come before me who think a name, a bank account, or a fancy suit can buy them the truth. You are not the first, and you certainly won't be the last. But let this be a lesson to anyone watching. Power was never meant to be a shield for deception. Justice does not care who your father is, what your last name is, or how much you spent on your tailor. Justice cares only about the facts, and the evidence you brought to this court today was nothing but a testament to your own moral failure." I picked up the gavel, the sound sharp and absolute. "Judgment is entered in favor of the plaintiff, Arthur Pendleton. The defendant is ordered to pay the full amount of $6,500 for the repairs, plus all associated court costs, immediately. Furthermore, given the flagrant submission of fraudulent evidence, the fabrication of a business and an invoice, this case is being referred to the state attorney for further investigation into criminal fraud and perjury." Marcus Vance didn't argue. He didn't interrupt. He simply slumped into his chair, a defeated man who had learned the hard way that character is what remains when power fails. The arrogance that had fueled his initial confidence had been replaced by the hollow realization of his own ruin. The hearing concluded, and as the gallery slowly cleared, I watched Arthur Pendleton walk over to Robert Vance. There was no exchange of animosity, only a quiet, solemn acknowledgement of the path they had both walked today. The case had become one of the most talked about moments in my career, a viral lesson for the world to see. It was a stark reminder that while charm, money, and status can attract people, they cannot outrun the truth. Privilege is not a permanent exemption from accountability. When the performance of privilege ends, justice begins. And that, in my courtroom, is the only way it will ever happen. Case dismissed.